During the Ramesside era, Egypt's government was organized into 4 distinct sectors, each with its own responsibilities. Supporting the royal court was the royal estate, which was overseen by a chancellor and a chief steward. The civil administration, led by 2 viziers, managed essential affairs such as taxation, agriculture, and judicial matters. Although the military was under the command of a general, it played a relatively minor role in domestic governance, despite being central to Egypt's foreign campaigns. Another major institution was the religious sector, which was headed by the overseer of priests serving all deities across both Upper and Lower Egypt. Typically, this high-ranking position was held by the high priest of Amun. Since the later years of Ramesses III's rule, the high priest of Amun had become the most influential figure in Upper Egypt, surpassing both the southern vizier and the mayor of Thebes in power. The Amun Ra temple complex at Ipitsut held vast estates, making it the largest landholder in the region. It employed thousands of tenant farmers and hundreds of artisans in its workshops. The temple's granaries, linked to the mortuary temples of Ramesses II and III, functioned as the primary grain reserve for both Thebes and the wider Upper Egyptian region. Whoever controlled Ipitsut controlled the city and its wealth. This powerful position was long held by members of a single family, that of Ramesses XI. Even during times of turmoil, this local dynasty brought a degree of continuity and order, though it could do little to alleviate the growing hardships faced by ordinary people. In 1091, however, mounting unrest in Thebes reached a boiling point. Driven by hunger and despair, and angered by the obstinacy of the high priest Amenhotep, the local populace succeeded in ousting him and installing a replacement of their own. For the next 8 months, Amenhotep was confined to his home, stripped of his status and wealth, and left politically isolated. For someone from Thebes's most elite lineage, it was a humiliating downfall. What made matters worse was that only one individual in Egypt held the authority to reinstate a high priest. Though the thought of appealing to the king was bitter, Amenhotep understood it was his only chance to reclaim power. Setting aside his pride, he sent a petition to Ramesses XI, who resided far away in the royal capital of Paramesses, asking to be restored to his former position. Ramesses found himself in an impossible position. Ignoring Amenhotep's pleas and allowing the usurper to remain in power at Ipitsut would have signaled weakness, effectively acknowledging the collapse of royal authority in Upper Egypt. On the other hand, reinstating Amenhotep would only reinforce the dominance of a family that had been quietly amassing influence for generations, often at the monarchy's expense. Neither path was ideal, but restoring the previous order seemed slightly less damaging. The challenge lay in executing that plan. Intelligence from Thebes suggested that the usurper would not surrender willingly and was entrenched within the fortified temple complex at Jim, known today as Medinet Habu. Yet the king was far away in the delta, along with most of Egypt's military forces. Sending troops south posed 2 major risks. It would entangle the crown in Thebes's turbulent politics and leave the royal seat exposed to potential threats. Only one viable military force remained. Thus, Ramesses issued a directive to the viceroy, Panehsy, instructing him to head north with his Nubian forces and deal with the situation. This would prove to be a grave miscalculation. Panehsy soon reached Thebes with a sizable force, and his troops surrounded Medinet Habu. A disorderly crowd broke into the temple precinct, expelling the usurper and defacing parts of the sanctuary. Other units roamed across the western bank, damaging numerous sacred sites. Though militarily effective, the campaign proved disastrous in terms of public perception. Once calm was restored and Amenhotep resumed his position, Panehsy quickly turned his attention to assessing the destruction, recovering looted items, and punishing those responsible. Some offenders were executed on the spot, without trial, as a show of force to re-establish control. The people of Thebes were swiftly reminded of the harsh realities of military rule. Having re-established order, Panehsy seized control of the local economy, taking command of the temple's grain reserves. Amenhotep, indebted to the viceroy for his reinstatement, could offer no protest. Before long, Panehsy began referring to himself as general and overseer of the pharaoh's granaries. The high priest of Amun no longer held real authority. For a time, he governed loyally in the name of the king, but Ramesses XI grew increasingly uneasy about his subordinates' expanding influence. The king sensed that he was losing his grip on Thebes and the entire southern region and resolved to reassert his dominance at any cost. Egypt's imperial reach had faded, its borders had become insecure, and famine plagued its people. If Ramesses XI could no longer maintain control over his own territory, he could scarcely claim to be a true pharaoh. The Ramesside line had always relied on military strength to maintain order, placing generals in positions of power and using force as a governing tool. Having empowered one military leader and come to regret it, Ramesses might have hesitated to do so again. But with his choices rapidly dwindling, he resorted to what he knew best. He summoned a northern general named Panehsy and ordered him to confront Panehsy and push the rebellious viceroy back into Nubia. The result was civil war. Panehsy, an astute strategist, chose not to wait passively for an attack. Instead, he decided to strike first, gathering the Theban garrisons and reinforcing them with local conscripts. He led his army northward to confront Panehsy's forces directly. Initially, Panehsy's campaign was promising. He reached Hardai in Middle Egypt and successfully captured and looted the town. For a brief moment, it appeared the royal army might suffer defeat. However, Panehsy's superior troop strength eventually turned the tide. By the end, Panehsy was driven out of Egypt, forced to retreat back to Nubia, stripped of honor and influence. While the conflict may have helped Ramesses XI maintain his image, it brought devastation to Thebes. With local garrisons depleted and many able-bodied men conscripted, the city was left exposed and vulnerable. Looting spread rapidly, targeting temples and royal tombs. Ramesses VI's burial site was violated once more, and even his sarcophagus was damaged. Making matters worse, Panehsy's retreating army adopted a scorched earth approach, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Monuments were vandalized in a frenzy of violence. When the chaos subsided, Ramesses himself made a rare journey from his northern residence to witness the destruction firsthand. The scene he encountered was bleak. Attempting to symbolically reverse the damage, Ramesses proclaimed a fresh beginning. The 19th year of his reign was renamed as the first year of a renaissance, with subsequent years following this new calendar. But few were convinced, least of all Panehsy, who had clearly emerged as the real victor over Panehsy. To cement his authority, Panehsy assumed the viceroy's former titles, then went even further by claiming the position of high priest as well. Holding military, economic, and religious power simultaneously, he became the true ruler of Upper Egypt. What was presented as the restoration of royal control was, in reality, just another military takeover. Panehsy, a hardened military commander, governed Thebes with unwavering authority. He carefully established a strong network of allies, surrounding himself with capable and loyal individuals. Among them was his wife, Najmet, a woman known for her strength and leadership. After imposing martial law, Panehsy's first major move was to lead a campaign into Nubia, determined to eliminate the threat of Panehsy for good. Securing the southern border was essential if his regime was to endure. While Panehsy was on campaign, Najmet oversaw Thebes, managing affairs in his absence. The couple maintained frequent communication, sharing updates on key developments. One particular exchange of letters reveals the darker nature of military rule. As discontent began to spread in Thebes, Najmet informed her husband that 2 policemen had been overheard making disloyal remarks. Even those tasked with maintaining order were beginning to question the junta. Panehsy's response was swift and brutal. "Bring those 2 policemen to my house, interrogate them immediately, and once you have learned the truth, have them executed and their bodies thrown into the river at night." Interrogation followed by silent elimination. This was the familiar fate of dissenters under a military regime. But political executions were not the only shadowy tactics employed by Panehsy to maintain his grip on power. In a letter sent from a Nubian front, he instructed two loyal Theban operatives, Budaman and Kar, to carry out a task unlike any they had ever done before. The vague wording was deliberate, masking the true nature of the order: orchestrated, state-sanctioned tomb robbery. With the conflict against Panehsy dragging on and funds running low, Panehsy needed a new source of revenue to support his military campaigns and secure his rule. The tombs scattered across the Theban hills became a tempting target. Rather than guarding these sacred sites, Panehsy's men embarked on a calculated mission of forced entry, plundering royal and noble tombs and funneling the loot back into government hands. As they scoured the West Bank for hidden burial chambers, they documented their findings to enable systematic looting later. Budaman alone inscribed over 130 graffiti, recording the locations of ancient wealth accumulated by generations of devout Thebans. Having endured foreign invasions, theft, and civil unrest, the few untouched tombs of the New Kingdom were now being exploited by those entrusted to protect them. In doing so, the regime shattered one final sacred boundary. A decade into its rule, the military junta faced its greatest challenge when Panehsy died suddenly. His sons were too young to assume command, and the prospect of a power vacuum threatened the fragile stability they had established. To prevent chaos, his supporters quickly installed a temporary successor. The decision proved wise. Herihor, a seasoned and capable leader from the same military class as Panehsy, shared his predecessor's assertive leadership style. Energetic in both his public duties and private affairs, he fathered 19 sons. Yet none of them would inherit his position. That outcome was shaped by Panehsy's widow, Najmet. In a masterful political maneuver, she married Herihor soon after Panehsy's death, instantly reinforcing his authority and maintaining her influence over future succession plans. That succession excluded the once powerful Ramesses royal line entirely. As Herihor consolidated military control in Upper Egypt, another general emerged as the dominant figure in the north. Egypt had effectively split in two, each half governed by its own military elite. Though both Herihor and Nesbene continued to acknowledge Ramesses XI in name, the real power lay elsewhere. Confined and sidelined in his palace, the last Ramesside pharaoh watched helplessly as his authority crumbled. By the time Ramesses XI lay dying in 1069, marking the end of a 30-year reign, even the Nile appeared to echo the close of an era. The Pelusiac branch had been silting up for years. By the end of his reign, the river channel was so choked with sediment that ships could no longer reach the city's harbors. It served as a stark metaphor for the kingdom's own decay. Deprived of trade and communication, the city's officials, merchants, and scribes abandoned Ramesses, relocating to a new site, Janet, modern Senelhagar, about 12 miles to the north. As Ramesses XI's funeral procession made its way from the emptying halls of Ramesses, followed by a small retinue of aging attendants, both the Ramesside dynasty and its capital passed into history together. When the last of the Ramesside pharaohs died in 1069, largely forgotten and without much public grief, Egypt entered a new and transformative chapter. Ramesses XI's death prompted two powerful leaders to adopt royal titles and symbols, effectively dividing the country between them. Whether this formal division of the two lands marked a rejection of the traditional pharaonic concept of national unity or a return to a more natural regional structure, it ushered in a prolonged era of political disunity not seen for 1,000 years. The Egyptians soon learned that regional independence and decentralization came with both advantages and drawbacks. In earlier times, a weak central authority might have had limited domestic consequences. But in the first millennium BCE, Egypt faced new external threats, surrounded by ambitious and much stronger foreign powers than ever before. From the 11th to the 4th century BCE, Egypt's vulnerability led to repeated invasions by foreign forces. The Libyans came first, followed by the Assyrians, Cushites, Babylonians, Persians, and eventually the Macedonians. These waves of immigration and foreign rule brought lasting changes to Egypt's political landscape, society, and culture. The age-old pharaonic civilization was irreversibly transformed. At the same time, Egyptian religion retreated from outside influence, becoming increasingly insular. Surrounded by younger, more energetic civilizations, Egypt's cultural withdrawal eventually led to stagnation and decline. This next chapter traces the turbulent final 1,000 years of ancient Egypt, from the Libyan ascendancy to the Roman conquest. The first 3 centuries after the fall of the Ramesside line were relatively stable, as various branches of a Libyan royal family managed to preserve a fragile balance of power. But this stability collapsed when Egypt's longtime southern rival, the Kingdom of Kush, returned in 728 BCE. For the next 4 centuries, the Nile Valley endured relentless division, warfare, and foreign rule. Egypt suffered 4 separate invasions by the Assyrians within just 30 years, culminating in the brutal sack of Thebes. Amid this upheaval, a dynasty from the city of Sais rose to power. They managed to throw off Assyrian dominance and defend against Babylonian attacks, but eventually fell to the Persians. Egypt had lost its crown to a resurgent Mesopotamia and never again reclaimed its leadership in the ancient Near East. Throughout the final native dynasties, the looming threat of Persia persisted. Instead of ruling like traditional pharaohs, Egypt's last homegrown kings often acted like rival warlords, squabbling over what was left of the kingdom. When Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BC, many Egyptians hoped for salvation. His brief stay in Egypt left a deep impression. His successors, the Ptolemies, tried to revive the glory of Egypt's past, though filtered through a distinctly Greek perspective. However, internal power struggles and the neglect of Upper Egypt led to growing instability, a prolonged rebellion in the south, and eventual collapse. The final chapter of ancient Egypt played out in the bustling streets of Alexandria, with a cast of iconic figures: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, bringing an end to a pharaonic tradition that had lasted for 3 millennia. At times, pharaonic propaganda must have sounded increasingly hollow. By the time Ramesses XI died in 1069, Egypt's rulers had spent nearly 150 years proclaiming grand victories over Libyan invaders. As early as 1208 BCE, Marinta had commissioned a monumental inscription at the temple of Amun in Ipitsut, boasting of his crushing defeat of a Libyan incursion led by a chieftain named Mary. But within just 3 years, the Libyans were back. Another military campaign, another triumphant inscription followed. What those celebratory records omitted was the fact that the government had been forced to place a defensive garrison in the southern oasis to prevent further desert infiltration. The invaders had effectively become the protectors. Under Ramesses III, battles against Libyan forces in 1182 and 1176 were far less decisive than the state propaganda claimed. Behind the rhetoric of victory, the Egyptian authorities saw fit to fortify temples along the west bank of the Nile. Although the Egyptians repelled Libyans from the western delta, many simply shifted their efforts south, slowly moving into the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt. The repeated assaults on Thebes in the late Ramesside period demonstrated their persistence and tenacity. Ramesses III also boasted about capturing thousands of Libyans, forcing them to cross the river into Egypt, where they were settled in fortified camps labeled as strongholds of the victorious king. These captives were branded with the pharaoh's name and subjected to forced assimilation, their language erased, their speech altered, and their lives redirected along unfamiliar paths. But in many cases, the assimilation was shallow at best. Large Libyan communities retained their cultural identity, especially around the entrance to the Fayum and the western fringes of the delta, where they formed distinct ethnic enclaves within the broader Egyptian population. By the reign of Ramesses V, a survey of landholdings in Middle Egypt recorded a significant number of individuals with non-Egyptian names. A generation later, A particularly unruly Libyan settlement near the town of Perhebit caused growing concern among Egyptian authorities. Over the course of the Ramesside era, Egypt had evolved into a dual-culture society, with a sizable Libyan minority that was becoming increasingly prominent. Among all state institutions, the army felt the effects of Libyan immigration most strongly. Egypt's military had long relied on foreign mercenaries and naturally became an appealing career path for many Libyan settlers. Whether serving in distant garrisons or fighting in active campaigns, Libyan soldiers earned a reputation for loyalty and competence throughout the latter half of the 20th dynasty. Some ambitious Libyan officers even rose to positions of considerable power within the Egyptian state. Notable among them were Panehsy and Pharaohs. By 1069, Libyans in Egypt had not only reached high-ranking positions. With the death of Ramesses XI, just 2 centuries after the first Libyan raids, the Nile Valley passed under foreign influence. For the first time in Egypt's long history, the former adversaries had become its rulers. For the next 4 centuries, Egypt fell under the control of Libyan power brokers. While the earliest of these foreign rulers, figures like Pharaohs and Nesbane adopted traditional Egyptian names invoking deities such as Horus and the ram god of Jadet, this display of pharaonic propriety was largely superficial. Beneath the surface, non-Egyptian cultural elements thrived. In the Libyan-dominated regions of the Delta, local elites proudly wore feathered ornaments in their hair and revived old Libyan noble titles. With Libyan generals firmly in power after Ramesses XI's death, their relatives had little incentive to assimilate. Over the following generations, many families unapologetically gave their children distinctly Libyan names. So rooted was this ethnic identity that, in the Western Delta, entire communities continued to identify as Libyan rather than Egyptian. Alongside the growing presence of Libyan names in formal inscriptions, the Egyptian language itself began to show signs of foreign influence. Since the Middle Kingdom, the classical Egyptian language had remained the benchmark of literacy and tradition. Meanwhile, the spoken vernacular had drifted far from this formal standard, evolving into a near-separate dialect. Native scribes, trained in the old forms, could navigate both with ease. But for Libyan officials and priests now managing the country's affairs, mastering even one form of the language posed a challenge. Unsurprisingly, inscriptions from the Libyan era reflect a preference for colloquial phrasing, straightforward grammar, and simpler vocabulary. Language held deep symbolic meaning for the Egyptian monarchy. Royal names and titles were carefully crafted to reflect divine authority and the ideology of kingship, setting the spiritual and political tone for each reign. But to the Libyan rulers, these traditions seemed foreign. They adopted the external symbols of Egyptian royalty without fully grasping their deeper significance. Titles were reused mechanically from one reign to the next, stripping them of their sacred uniqueness. The time-honored epithet, dual king, lost its spiritual resonance, reduced to a mere label. In naming themselves, the kings of the 21st dynasty often went overboard, selecting awkward and overly elaborate names like Pace-Bikinianiad, meaning the star rises over the city. These clumsy attempts at authenticity lacked credibility and failed to resonate. What the Libyan elite truly valued, however, was lineage. Their strong attachment to ancestry reflected their cultural roots in oral tradition, a hallmark of non-literate, semi-nomadic societies. Even after adopting writing from the Egyptians, they maintained a passion for tracing and honoring long family histories. One priest from Yenu, for instance, commissioned a monument listing 13 generations of ancestors despite the fact that his family had remained in the same city, serving in the same role for 11 of those generations. Another legacy from the Libyans' nomadic heritage was their relatively indifferent attitude toward death and the afterlife. Their ancestors, who had roamed the land herding animals, were accustomed to burying their dead quickly and with minimal ceremony, wherever death happened to occur. In stark contrast, ancient Egyptian society had always placed great emphasis on funerary customs and preparations for the afterlife. Yet the Libyan rulers of Egypt remained true to their cultural roots, displaying a nonchalance toward death that likely shocked their Egyptian contemporaries. Rather than elaborate individual tombs, they opted for shared family vaults, sparsely decorated and devoid of grandeur. Even the Libyan pharaohs were buried alongside relatives in modest stone tombs, assembled from reused materials. Funerary goods were frequently recycled from nearby graves, suggesting that outfitting the dead for eternity was seen less as a sacred duty and more as a task to be done quickly and inexpensively. The construction of opulent royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and lavish mortuary temples on the Theban plain came to an abrupt end. Tombs no longer served as sacred spaces connecting the living and the divine. They become little more than burial pits. Just as their views on death altered Egyptian funerary traditions, the Libyans' preferred style of governance had a profound effect on Egypt's political structure. In their native Cyrenaica, Libyan society was organized tribally, with loosely defined leadership rooted in family bonds, marital alliances, and local loyalties. This system stood in stark contrast to Egypt's long-standing tradition of a centralized, absolute monarchy. Even before the new kingdom had officially ended, Libyan generals like Panehsy and Herihor had already demonstrated their disregard for unified rule. While Egypt had always recognized the administrative division between Upper and Lower Egypt, this was traditionally balanced by a single king who symbolically unified the two lands. After Ramesses XI's death, his Libyan successors abandoned this principle. To them, ruling the country through two concurrent monarchs was not a breakdown of order, but a practical expression of decentralized governance. Alliances, often cemented through marriage, helped preserve loyalty between the two ruling branches and prevented the emergence of rival dynasties. However, this shift toward decentralization came at a price. The Libyans granted unprecedented authority to royal sons, assigning them control over key cities and regions. These moves gradually eroded the power of the central government and diminished the influence of the monarchy, setting Egypt on a path of long-term fragmentation. But that lay in the future. For the moment, with the last of the Ramesside pharaohs laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings, the Libyan rulers saw their position as secure. One commanded Upper Egypt, the other ruled the Delta. Although the story of the late 20th dynasty is most vividly reflected in the monuments and political intrigues of Thebes, the true center of government and the main royal residence remained in the north. Since the earliest days of Egyptian history, Memphis had served as the nation's capital, maintaining its role as the hub of state administration throughout the Ramesside era. While Thebes rose to prominence as the religious heart of the nation, it was in Memphis that royal edicts were proclaimed, high officials were appointed, and monarchs were crowned. The royal palace, meanwhile, had been located at Ramesses since the reign of Ramesses II. Politically, the Delta held seniority over the Nile Valley in the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. Thus, when authority was formally split between Herihor and Nesbene following the death of Ramesses XI, it was Nesbene who assumed the royal title, while his brother-in-law took a secondary role as military commander and high priest of Ammonius. This arrangement preserved the illusion of national unity, though in practice it reflected a dual kingship held together mainly through family ties. This division of Egypt into two parallel political entities became the defining hallmark of Libyan rule. Each half of the country developed its own government, administrative structure, and ceremonial capital. The once symbolic concept of the two lands had now become a political reality. The Delta, which had seen the highest concentration of Libyan settlement in the final years of the New Kingdom, was most strongly shaped by this new political landscape. Its dense marshes and complex network of waterways naturally lent themselves to political decentralization. During the height of Libyan dominance, the Delta fragmented into a mosaic of rival power centers. These regions were governed by local chieftains who nominally acknowledged the authority of the central royal house. In truth, however, the king was little more than a leading figure among regional peers. Still, the monarchs who ruled from Janat, known to the classical world as Tanis, were aware of their ceremonial importance and undertook an ambitious project to reflect their royal status. The transformation of their residence into a grand ceremonial capital, comparable in magnificence to Thebes. Janet, originally intended to replace the increasingly impractical site of Ramesses, expanded rapidly under the patronage of the northern kings. Situated on a major branch of the Nile, the location was ideal for trade as well as fishing and bird hunting. To make way for residences and public structures, the first step was to reinforce the riverbanks and reclaim surrounding land. Only after this foundational work could large-scale construction truly begin. To establish Janet as a northern equivalent to Thebes, it needed a ceremonial centerpiece of equal grandeur. However, many of Egypt's most important quarries were under Theban control, and the economic resources of the northern kings were quite limited. Launching a full-scale royal construction project reminiscent of the grand undertakings of the new kingdom was no longer feasible. Instead, Nesbane and his successors, Amun and Panehsy I, chose a more pragmatic approach, repurposing monuments and materials from nearby Ramesses and other locations in the delta. The once glorious royal city of the Ramessides was systematically dismantled, its obelisks, statues, and stone blocks hauled 12 miles to Janet and reassembled. Often, these appropriated monuments were left with their original inscriptions, suggesting that the northern rulers merely went through the motions of upholding traditional pharaonic customs. Atop a sandy rise, previously used as a cemetery for the local poor during the Ramesside era, Panehsy at first constructed the heart of his northern Thebes, a temple complex dedicated to the Theban triad of Amun, Amut, and Khonsu. To emphasize the sanctity of the site, he enclosed it within a massive brick wall and designated part of the compound as the royal burial ground for his dynasty. Just as Thebes was hallowed by its union of temples and royal tombs, so too would Janet find sacred identity through this new combination. By the standards of a new kingdom, the Libyan royal tombs at Janet were modest, even crude. However, what Panehsy's tomb lacked in scale, it made up for in splendor. His mummy was placed in a silver coffin, resting on a silver sheet within a granite sarcophagus that had ironically been taken from the Theban tomb of Marinta, a former adversary of the Libyans. A golden mask covered the king's face, and his body was surrounded by opulent treasures, gold and silver vessels, ornate jewelry, a lapis lazuli necklace, ceremonial scepters, and even gold coverings for his fingers and toes. Yet this display of wealth did not serve to distinguish the monarch from his subjects in the way it might have in earlier times. Sharing the tomb with Panehsy was a man of similarly lavish burial, not a royal heir, but one of his highest officials. Winjibenjedit, a general and temple steward of Khonsu, likely served as the king's deputy in religious functions. Despite his non-royal status, his burial was equally extravagant. Among his grave goods were several gold cups, a heart scarab on a gold chain, pectorals, divine figurines, and a stunning image of the god Ta carved from lapis lazuli and housed in a golden shrine. He also wore gold rings, one of which had been taken from the tomb of Ramesses IX. This particular item offers a revealing insight into the source of such immense wealth. The rulers of Janet and their loyal officials obtained their funerary riches, but by means of systematic reuse and outright looting. To fully grasp how far the monarchy had fallen from its former ideals, one must look south. While the Nile Delta was marked by clusters of Libyan settlers and leaned toward political fragmentation, the situation in Upper Egypt was quite different. The Nile Valley remained largely ethnically uniform, with native Egyptians making up the vast majority of the population. Its geography naturally encouraged centralized control. Thebes continued to be the dominant city. Thus, for Upper Egypt, the collapse of a new kingdom didn't result in regional autonomy, but instead signaled another extended period of Theban dominance. Though thoroughly Egyptian in character, Thebes had already come under Libyan influence during the so-called Renaissance under Ramesses XI, largely due to Libyan figures holding high military office. It was under the leadership of the military junta, led by Panehsy, that systematic looting of royal tombs began under state direction. While on campaign in Nubia, Panehsy sent instructions to Thebes directing the necropolis scribe Budaman and his assistant Car to identify and preserve the seal of an ancestral tomb. The proceeds were intended to support military campaigns against Panehsy and to fund Panehsy's broader ambitions. That this looting occurred while the monarchy still technically stood reveals where the true power had shifted. Once Ramesses XI passed away and the new kingdom faded into history, the military rulers of Thebes, now unofficial monarchs of Upper Egypt, no longer needed to hide their activities. The dismantling of the royal necropolis became an overt state policy. Initially, the focus was on tombs from the 17th dynasty, royal family burials in the Valley of the Queens, and mortuary temples located near the cultivated land. Eventually, under the guise of protecting these tombs, the authorities turned their attention to the Valley of the Kings itself. By Herihor's fourth year in power, Budaman received orders to conduct operations in the tomb of Horemheb. Over the following decade, the resting places of the New Kingdom kings were systematically looted. It's likely that workers, possibly guided by a detailed map supplied by the authorities, moved methodically from tomb to tomb. Their main aim was to collect the immense wealth buried in the Theban hills. These items were quickly transferred to the state treasury, while the mummies, often stripped in the search for hidden jewelry, were brought to Budaman's administrative office at Medinet Habu for rewrapping and documentation. It's no surprise that Budaman proudly adopted the title, overseer of the treasuries of the kings, with no apparent sense of irony. Tomb robbery became so rampant that private citizens designed their own graves to be as difficult to access as possible. Beyond theft, there was another goal: to find a permanent repository for the displaced royal remains. Eventually, the tomb of Amenhotep II, situated next to that of Horemheb, was chosen as a mass burial site. Around 1050 BCE, the remains of Egypt's deified rulers were unceremoniously gathered and deposited together in a side chamber. In this disordered assembly, Amenhotep III was placed in a coffin inscribed for Ramesses III, sealed with a lid meant for Seti II. Merinta ended up in Sethnak's coffin, while his own sarcophagus was shipped north to Janet, where it served as the final resting place for Panehsy I, a Libyan king. The Thutmose IV lay next to the boy king Siptah, and the military brute Sethnak was placed beside the disease-ridden Ramesses V. This was a brutal violation of traditions Egypt had long held sacred. A second, equally prestigious group of royal ancestors were buried in a different tomb, originally meant for a 17th dynasty queen, awaiting a more permanent and respectful resting place. What was officially described as a restoration effort resulted in enormous wealth being concentrated in the hands of Thebes' military and religious elite. Some of this treasure made its way north to Janet, where it was buried with Panehsy I and his trusted courtier, Wenjabenjedit. However, the bulk of the plunder remained in Thebes, boosting the southern rulers' fortunes and solidifying their hold on power. Both Herihor and his successor Panehsy first grew confident enough to adopt royal titles, openly challenging their nominal superiors in the north. Herihor limited his royal claims to the sacred spaces of the Ipit Sut temple, avoiding direct confrontation, but Panehsy had no such hesitation. His inscriptions from the second and third decades of his leadership refer to his own reign, with barely a mention of the kings in Janet. For his burial in the Theban hills, he reused coffins from Thutmose I's tomb, aiming to cloak his rule with the prestige of the 18th dynasty. In the end, the institution of kingship may have survived the fall of the Ramessides, but it did so by devouring its own past. While seizing the wealth and symbols of kingship may have been relatively easy, earning genuine legitimacy proved far more difficult. Until the final days of the New Kingdom, Egyptians had viewed Libyans with typical disdain. To the confident natives of the Nile Valley, these bearded, feather-adorned tribes from beyond the Sahara were seen at best as hired soldiers, and at worst, as uncivilized barbarians. So it was highly unlikely that within a single generation, the same Libyans could expect to be embraced as Egypt's rightful rulers. To overcome this challenge, the Libyans turned, as so often in Egyptian politics, to religion. It was no coincidence that at both Janet and Thebes, temples became central to their rule. The temple of Amunias Ra at Ipitsut had long been the spiritual heart of New Kingdom kingship. By constructing a similar sanctuary in Janet, their northern stronghold, Nesbanebjetit and his successors were deliberately trying to harness divine authority to validate their foreign rule. Conveniently, this approach could be framed as a continuation of Ramesses XI's Renaissance, a return to the mythical Golden Age when the gods ruled directly over Egypt. In truth, however, it marked a clear departure from New Kingdom traditions of governance. From this point on, supreme power was no longer vested in the king, but rather in Amunias Ra himself. His name was written in a royal cartouche, just like a king's. He was declared dual king, ruler of the gods, lord of the heavens, the earth, the waters, and the mountains. In temple carvings, Ammonius was sometimes shown in the place of the human ruler while being widely acknowledged as Egypt's true sovereign. Nesbanebjetit's short-lived successor, Amenemnisu, took this even further by incorporating the phrase, Ammonius is king, into his own name. With the god cast as the supreme monarch, the earthly king was relegated to the role of divine servant. Paspakini at first, ruling from Janet, even styled himself high priest of Ammonius, and included the title within a cartouche as a substitute for a throne name. In Thebes, his half-brother Menkapera served as high priest of Ammonius as well. This theocratic model of governance proved to be an effective solution to two pressing issues. First, it made it theologically acceptable to have multiple rulers operating simultaneously, since they were all subordinate to the single true king. Second, it made Libyan dominance more acceptable to the Egyptian public, particularly in the south, where religious devotion remained deeply rooted. In practice, the theocracy served as a useful disguise for a fractured and divided monarchy. To sustain this illusion, oracles became an integral part of statecraft. In both Janet and Thebes, Ammonius was said to hold court and issue decrees, mirroring the behavior of human kings. In Thebes, this culminated in a formal ritual known as the Beautiful Festival of the Divine Audience, during which Ammonius' oracle would pronounce on matters of state. The primary beneficiaries of this system, besides the Libyan rulers themselves, were the priests who managed and interpreted the divine will. Living in considerable comfort within the sacred complex of Ipitsut, they ensured their own prosperity while continuing to serve their god. The priests' devotion to wealth proved just as strong as their devotion to the gods, surfacing most clearly during the tenure of Panehsy II. At Ipitsut, tensions erupted into a bitter conflict between two priestly groups centered on control of temple resources. The gods' servants, as the senior order, jealously guarded their exclusive access to the innermost sanctuary as sacred space forbidden to the general populace. This privileged position also granted them first access to the offerings placed before Ammonius' cult statue during daily rituals. Once these offerings were ritually used by the deity, they were collected and redistributed among the god's servants, a profitable perk of their station. By contrast, the pure ones were barred from entering the sanctuary. Their duties were more peripheral, often confined to the temple's outer areas. One of their key responsibilities was transporting Ammonius' bark shrine during ceremonial processions, both within the temple grounds and through the streets of Thebes. In earlier times, this humble role may have gone unnoticed. But now, in an era when divine oracles played a central role in governance, every subtle motion of the bark was interpreted as divine communication. As the bearers of such symbolic power, these porters became acutely aware that the fate of the nation literally rested on their shoulders. Seizing the opportunity, they began leveraging their influence for material gain. Their push for a greater share of temple wealth brought them into direct conflict with the god servants, introducing a new political dimension to a centuries-old religious hierarchy. The immense riches controlled by the Ammonius priesthood, particularly in Thebes, were too enticing for the Libyan elite to ignore. They employed every strategy available to secure positions within the temple hierarchy. Women, especially wives and daughters, played a pivotal role in this effort, advancing their families' fortunes by vying for influential priestly offices. Over time, one such position grew so prominent that it even surpassed the high priesthood in status. Although the Theban rulers who followed the Ramesside era styled themselves as high priests of Ammonius and claimed to govern under divine instruction, their actual authority was rooted in military dominance. Their rule was sustained by the force of arms, not religious legitimacy. Herihor and those who succeeded him understood that military power was the surest foundation for control. From the beginning, they bolstered their rule with a network of fortified garrisons spread across Upper Egypt. By the end of Ramesses XI's reign, however, those same forts had been seized by Libyan leaders and repurposed as strategic bases for their own takeover. These strongholds allowed the new rulers to monitor river traffic, quash dissent, and maintain tight control of the region. It's little surprise that the general's regime was able to take root with minimal resistance. Foremost among these forts was Tadj, strategically located on the east bank of the Nile, just south of the Fayum's entrance. It marked the northern boundary of Theban-controlled territory and served as the main residence of the general priests. Tellingly, from Panehsy onward, these military rulers made only occasional appearances in Thebes, usually for religious festivals or major public ceremonies. Instead, they chose the safety of their fortified northern base over their traditional palace within Thebes, likely aware of the deep-seated resentment their regime faced from the conservative southern populace. Tensions that had long simmered in Upper Egypt finally erupted during a moment of vulnerability for the military regime. When Panehsy declared himself king, he appointed his eldest son, Massaharda, as high priest of Ammonius. For many Egyptians, having someone with such an overtly Libyan name in this sacred position was deeply offensive. However, when Massaharda died unexpectedly in 1044 BCE, the people of Thebes seized the opportunity and rose in rebellion. Massaharda's successor, his younger brother Jechkin held the high priesthood for only a short time before being ousted. To skeptics, this swift downfall casts serious doubt on the reliability of divine oracles, especially since his name, meaning Khonsu has said he shall live, was undermined by a fate determined not by divine will, but by human unrest. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Upper Egypt might reclaim its autonomy. But the army commanders had no intention of relinquishing control. From the safety of their stronghold at Tadj, Panehsy acted swiftly, appointing his third son, Menkheperra, as the new high priest and dispatching him south in bravery and strength to pacify the land and subdue its foe. With the full support of the military, Menkheperra crushed the revolt and reasserted his family's dominance over Thebes. The leaders of the uprising were captured and exiled to the western desert oases. Their death sentences were commuted to internal banishment. Only after several years, once resistance had been thoroughly extinguished, were the exiles permitted to return. Still, Menkheperra retained the authority to execute anyone who threatened his life in the future. To reinforce his power and send a clear message, he ordered a new network of fortresses to be constructed closer to Thebes on both banks of the Nile. Like the Norman castles that later dominated England, these Libyan-built strongholds loomed over the Nile Valley as constant reminders of foreign rule. Across the country, even civilian towns were increasingly fortified. The Egyptians, feeling alienated and fearful in their own land, began enclosing themselves behind high walls. In the final years of Ramesses XI's reign, General Panehsy posed a pointed rhetorical question in a letter home. Who does Pharaoh still reign over? The question itself revealed the answer. Royal authority was in rapid decline, and the traditional structure of pharaonic rule was on the verge of a dramatic transformation. The formal split between the northern kings based in Janat and their southern counterparts only further eroded the monarchy's prestige. Panehsy's prolonged conflict with Panehsy, the viceroy of Kush, failed to reclaim Nubia for Egypt. With access to the vital gold mines and the trade routes of sub-Saharan Africa cut off, Egypt's economy began to falter. Meanwhile, the loss of colonies in the Near East dealt another blow to the state's finances and diminished its influence in Mediterranean trade. Even if Herihor and Nesbene had the ability to mobilize the country's workforce as in earlier times, the depleted treasury left no room for ambitious building schemes. The best they could manage was to dismantle the ruins of Ramesses and reuse the stone to build their ceremonial city. Unlike their new kingdom predecessors, most of these rulers didn't even bother to inscribe their accomplishments at Thebes. Herihor's military regime could have attempted to reclaim lost prestige by launching foreign campaigns in the traditional pharaonic style. But Nubia lay too far to the south and was too dangerous, while the Near East was beyond reach, lying behind the northern kingdom's territory. More crucially, the military was preoccupied with maintaining order within Egypt itself, leaving neither the time nor inclination for overseas ventures. Nothing reflects Egypt's plummeting status on the world stage more vividly than the report of Weneman, a narrative written during the early part of Herihor's rule. Whether the account is factual or fictional, it underscores Egypt's weakened position by highlighting the humiliation suffered by its envoys abroad. According to the report, Weneman, a senior priest from the Ipit Sut temple, was dispatched in 1065 BCE to Kebni to procure cedar wood for Ammonius Array's bark shrine. For 2,000 years, the forests of Lebanon had supplied Egypt with cedar, and such missions had once been routine. After paying his respects to King Nesbene and Queen Tinemen in Janat, Weneman set sail for Kebni, following the same coastal route taken by many Egyptian expeditions before him. However, upon arriving in the harbor of Dor in southern Palestine, Weneman was robbed. His appeal to the local ruler for compensation was ignored, leaving him stranded for 9 days before he could continue his journey. Entire, desperate, and out of options, he resorted to theft himself, stealing from a vessel owned by the Checker. Ironically, a group that had invaded Egypt alongside other sea peoples a century earlier during Ramesses III's reign. After fleeing at dawn to escape punishment, Weneman reached Kebni, only to be denied entry to the port by the local ruler. In this new political climate of the 11th century BCE, an Egyptian envoy without gifts or credentials was no more welcome than any other stranger. The situation was deeply humiliating, both for Weneman and the regime that had sent him. He had to endure nearly a month of waiting for funds to be sent from Egypt, all while suffering the mockery of the Kebni ruler. When the payment finally arrived, he received the timber but narrowly escaped arrest for his earlier theft, as the Checker had caught up with him. He fled once again, this time to Cyprus. It was at this point that the text abruptly ends, but its message is unmistakable. Egypt had fallen far from its former greatness. Back in the distant era of the 12th dynasty, another revered piece of Egyptian literature, the tale of Sinew, had centered on the experiences of an Egyptian in foreign lands. But the contrast between Sinew's journey and that of Weneman couldn't be starker. Whereas Sinew had embodied the strength and prestige of Egypt to his hosts in Palestine, Weneman's story illustrated just how far Egypt had fallen. The reversal was complete. One final embarrassment still awaited Egypt in its interactions with the former territories it once dominated in the Near East. A partially preserved relief depicting King Simon, discovered in Janat, suggests that this Libyan ruler may have launched a military campaign into southern Palestine, possibly taking the city of Gezer. However, instead of incorporating the conquest into Egypt or dedicating its riches to the temple of Ammonius XI, appears to have used the spoils for diplomatic leverage. According to the biblical account in the first book of Kings, he offered the treasures of Gezer, along with his daughter, as a gift to King Solomon of Israel. In the height of the new kingdom, Egypt had often strengthened alliances by marrying foreign princesses, but had never permitted an Egyptian royal daughter to be given away in such a manner. By the 10th century BCE, the reality had shifted. Egypt, once a towering power, had become fragmented and diminished, no longer a dominant force, but merely a minor participant in the complex and unstable politics of the Near East. Its former glory had faded, its influence diminished, and hopes of restoring the grandeur of a new kingdom seemed remote. The political division of Egypt into its northern and southern regions may have reflected the new reality, but it clashed directly with traditional Egyptian ideology. That belief system championed the king as the unifier of the two lands and viewed separation as a descent into disorder. As the earlier Hyksos period had shown, the enduring power of pharaonic traditions often had a way of reasserting itself. And as the Libyan ruling elite grew more established and confident in their authority, something unexpected began to happen. This shift was first visible in Thebes, the stronghold of pharaonic orthodoxy. After Panehsy's first period of rule, later high priests abandoned the practice of taking royal titles. Instead, they began dating their monuments according to the reigns of the recognized kings in Jannet. Figures like Menkaperra, Nesbanebjet II, and Panehsy II remained just as authoritative as those before them, but they were now willing to acknowledge the supremacy of a single sovereign ruler. This seemingly minor change marked a significant evolution in political thinking. That unification began to materialize in the mid-10th century BCE. Toward the end of Panehsy II's reign, authority in Thebes was delegated to a dynamic and ambitious Libyan leader from Bast named Shoshenq. Holding the title of Great Chief of Chiefs, Shoshenq emerged as a dominant figure in the royal court. His political savvy was further demonstrated by marrying his son to Panehsy's eldest daughter, cementing ties with the royal family. When Panehsy died, Shoshenq was in a prime position to seize the throne. Shoshenq's rise marked more than the beginning of Egypt's 22nd dynasty. From the start, Shoshenq first sought to consolidate control, restore the authority of the monarchy, and return Egypt to a form of centralized government reminiscent of the New Kingdom. Breaking from recent precedent, he discontinued the routine use of divine oracles in state affairs. For Shoshenq, the king's word was law, and he had no need for divine mediation. Only in distant Nubia, at the Grand Temple of Amun in Napata, did the institution of the oracle continue to thrive. Though his name and heritage were Libyan, Shoshenq first held undisputed authority over all of Egypt. He also had a shrewd strategy for maintaining control over Upper Egypt and curbing the region's drift toward autonomy. By installing his own son as both high priest of Ammonius and military commander in Thebes, he secured unwavering loyalty from the south. Other loyalists and royal relatives were strategically placed in key roles across the land, while local elites were encouraged to marry into the royal line. When the third prophet of Ammonius took Shoshenq's daughter as his wife, the king could be confident that the Theban priesthood was firmly under his influence. In many ways, Egypt was once again operating as it had in the glory days of old. To assert his newly consolidated authority, Shoshenq turned to the royal archives and embraced the duties traditionally expected of an Egyptian pharaoh. He ordered the reopening of stone quarries and worked with his architects to design grand building projects. Even as he authorized further removals of new kingdom monarchs from their tombs in the Valley of the Kings, he was careful to present himself as a devout ruler, keen to make generous contributions to Egypt's revered temples. For the first time in over 100 years, intricate reliefs were carved on temple walls to celebrate a ruler's deeds. Still, amid the religious patronage and the resurgence of royal iconography, Shoshenq recognized that something essential was missing. In past eras, no true pharaoh would have stood by while Egypt's influence on the global stage diminished. The great monarchs of a new kingdom had been warriors as well as rulers, always ready to protect Egyptian interests and expand its frontiers. The time had come to revive that spirit. It was time to remind the Near East that Egypt remained a power to be reckoned with. An incident at the border in 925 BCE provided the perfect pretext. With a formidable army composed of Libyan fighters and traditional Nubian mercenaries, Shoshenq departed from his Delta capital to reassert Egypt's dominance. According to ancient sources, there were also deeper political motives at play. Whatever the backdrop, once Egyptian forces crushed Semitic tribes that had encroached on the Bitter Lakes region, the campaign moved decisively to Gaza, long the launching point for expeditions into the broader Near East. After taking the city, Shoshenq divided his army into 4 divisions, an echo of Ramesses II's famous battle formations at Kadesh. One unit pushed southeast into the Negev to seize the fortress of Shirun. Another advanced eastward toward Beersheba and Arad. A third marched northeast toward Hebron and Judah's fortified hill towns. Meanwhile, the main body, led by Shoshenq himself, followed the coastal route before turning inland to attack Judah from the north. Biblical accounts describe him as capturing Judah's fortified cities and reaching the gates of Jerusalem. Though the city itself does not appear in the victory list Shoshenq had engraved at the temple of Ipit-Sut, it's plausible he extracted tribute without launching a full-scale assault. The complaint that he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the king's palace. He took everything, may well reflect historical reality. With Judah subdued, the Egyptian campaign pressed on. The next target was the fragmented kingdom of Israel, with Shechem falling in their path. Other familiar names from Egypt's imperial past reappeared: Beth-Shan, once a strategic base for Ramesses II, Tanakh, and Megiddo, where Thutmose III had won his legendary victory centuries before. Determined to immortalize his own conquests, Shoshenq commissioned a commemorative inscription at the fortress of Megiddo. His campaign then wound southward again, passing through Aruna and Yeum to Gaza, the border crossing at Raphia, along the ways of Horus, and finally home to Egypt. Once back on native soil, Shoshenq fulfilled his royal obligations by initiating a major expansion of the temple at Ipit-Sut. The new gateway was adorned with reliefs celebrating his military triumphs, portraying the king striking down foreign enemies under the watchful gaze of Ammonius and the personification of victorious Thebes. But if this campaign was intended to herald a revival of Egyptian greatness, the results were ultimately disappointing. Before construction at Ipit-Sut could be completed, Shoshenq first died unexpectedly. Deprived of his leadership, the building efforts were abruptly halted and the temples fell silent. His successors failed to continue his vision, reverting instead to a passive and limited style of governance. Their ambitions were modest, their outlook provincial. Egypt's fleeting resurgence on the international stage faded just as quickly as it had emerged. And rather than being impressed by Shoshenq's brief assertion of royal might, Thebes began to chafe under Delta rule once again. The threat of disunity returned to haunt the city once more.